Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where and when you choose to listen. My name is John O'Keefe. Welcome to our third opportunity to read an incredibly good book, Wilson Rawls' Where the Red Fern Grows. While I am doing my little bit of babbling at the beginning, nice alliteration, bit of babbling at the beginning, I need to ask you, if you haven't done so yet, grab hold of your reading journal, grab hold of that piece of paper, grab hold of something that you can write with, and take the opportunity to be like Olympia from Seattle, Washington, who is listening right now. My little first grade niece, it is so cool that you have joined us. I want to let you know that if you go back to chapters 3 and 4, then scroll down to the comments, her dad gave us permission to share her verbal to visual. That is so cool. I'm telling you, ladies and gentlemen, whether you are 5 years old, 6 years old, 7 years old, or 32, or 45, or older than that, you can participate in whatever way you choose. I want to let you in on just a little bit of a background secret. Those of you who have been in my classroom understand this really well. I was not a very good reader. I did not like to read. I felt like reading was hard. I felt reading was a challenge. I felt reading didn't quite make very much sense to me when I was in school. One of my big problems was I never asked for help. And so I've learned to recognize when kids seem to need some help. But also at the same time, one of the other things that I often recognize is how important it is to ask for help. So I've got friends in my story, especially a man by the name of Josh Kahn, who recognized as a best friend that I didn't do a very good job reading, and he started helping me do that. And that's one of the big reasons why I want to work with us on not just reading it, but also understanding what's happening while I read, and as I read, the way that my brain is always talking to me. The one cool thing that you can always do is read with someone, and that's what we're doing right now. If you have somebody who's bigger and maybe has a little bit more personal experience, every once in a while, if a weird word comes up, it's okay to say, hey, what does that word mean? You know, the other thing that I want to share with you is that as we begin today, I want to remind you of a few things that have happened so that you can keep reminding yourself of what's going on. Now, of course, if you haven't heard the first 4 chapters, it's not enough just to hear my little bit of a summary. Now, if I had Olivia's picture right here, I'd probably be able to share it. Olympia's picture, sorry about that. I would be able to share it and be able to show you little bits and pieces of how Olympia remembers very important parts of the story. She remembered very importantly that Billy only had 23 cents, that Billy spent 2 years earning money for the little puppies that he is almost going to pick up at the depot. She spoke a lot about how he had to walk a long distance overnight to try to get to those puppies, and that he came into a town and that there were some kids who treated him a little bit rough. There were some kids who treated him like he was a hillbilly, because he wore overalls and his hair was a little bit shaggy and he walked around with bare feet. And he had never really seen a school, that he only went to school at home. And so it's funny how we're all there now. So I suppose we're all hillbillies. I'm just kidding. So the reality right now is as we get into our story tonight or today, I want you to pay some close attention to who the most important characters are. Now, of course, we're going to be paying close attention to Billy because it's his story, but also who else comes into the story. Where do you feel joy? Where do you feel happiness? Where might you feel a little bit spooked? That's an important part of today's lesson. And so as we get into our story today, I want you to pay attention to the way in which the author describes feelings today. Okay, so pay close attention to that. So I want to give one more shout out before we go on. I want to let you know that I have a young lady by the name of Susan who lives out in Lacey, Washington, who joined us for the first time yesterday and watched both of the videos thus far. And I want to say that Susan is the elder sister of 3 darling kids who I had the joy of teaching when I was at the Wahilute Indian School. And so I was wearing this sweatshirt in pride of those folks out there. And so I wanted to say hello to you, Susan. Thank you so much for joining us. And I hope that you're enjoying the story as much as we are. The other thing that's really cool about today is that I got my book. So I don't have to stick my face right in front of you anymore. I'm going to get to open this book. And there is nothing like having a little book in front of you and reading out loud. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, here we go. Chapter 5, Where the Red Fern Grows. On arriving at the depot, my nerve failed me. I was afraid to go in. I didn't know what I was scared of, but I was scared. Before going around to the front, I peeked in a window. The station master was in his office looking at some papers. He was wearing a funny little cap that had no top on it. He looked friendly enough, but I still couldn't muster up enough courage to walk in those doors. I cocked my ear to see if I could hear puppies crying, but I didn't hear a thing. A bird started chirping. It was a yellow canary in a cage. The station master walked over and gave it some water. I thought, anyone that is kind to birds surely wouldn't be mean to a boy. With my courage built up, I walked around to the front and eased myself past the office. He glanced at me and turned back to the papers. I walked clear around the depot and again walked slowly past the office. Glancing from the corner of my eye, I saw the station master looking at me and smiling. He opened the door and came out onto the platform. I stopped and leaned against the building. Yawning and stretching his arms, he said, "Sure is hot today. Doesn't look like it's ever going to rain." I looked up at the sky and said, "Yes, sir. It is hot, and we sure could do with a bit of rain. We need one bad. We need one bad up where I come from." He asked me where I lived. I told him, "Up there a ways." "You know," he said, "I've got some puppies in there for a boy that lives up on the river. His name is Billy Coleman. I know his dad, but never have seen the boy. I figured he would be in after them today or maybe tomorrow." On hearing this remark, my heart jumped clear up into my throat. I thought surely it was going to hop right out on the depot platform. I looked up and tried to tell him who I was, but something went wrong. When the words finally came out, they sounded like squeaky old pulleys on our well outside Mama drew up a bucket of water from. I could see a twinkle in the station master's eyes. He came over and laid his hand on my shoulder. In a friendly voice, he said, "So, you're Billy Coleman. How's your dad?" I told him Papa was fine and handed him the slip my grandpa had given me to prove who I was. "They sure are fine-looking pups," he said. "You'll have to go around to the freight door, though." I'm sure my feet never touched the ground as I flew around that building. He unlocked the door and I stepped in, looking for my dogs. I couldn't see anything but boxes, barrels, and trunks, and some rolls of barbed wire. The kindly station master walked over to one of those boxes. "Do you want the box and all?" he asked. I told him I didn't want the box. All I wanted was the dogs. "How are you going to carry them dogs?" he said. "I think they're a little too young just to follow you." I held out my gunny sack. He looked at me and looked at the sack. Chuckling, he said, "Well, I guess dogs can be carried that way, same as anything else. But we'll have to cut a few holes in it to stick their heads through so that they won't smother." Getting a claw hammer, he started tearing off the top of the box. As nails gave way and boards splintered, I heard several puppy whimpers. I didn't walk over, I just stood and waited. After what seemed like hours, the box was opened. He reached in and he lifted the pups out and he set them down on the floor in front of me. What are you doing right now? Are you waiting? Are you sitting there like leaning in right now, wondering what's going to happen next? Me too. I can't stop. Here we go. "Well, there they are," he said. "What do you think of them?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. All I could do was stare at them. They seemed to be blinded by the light and kept blinking their eyes. One sat down on his little rear end and started crying. The other one was waddling around and whimpering. I wanted so much to step over and pick them up. Several times I tried to move my feet, but they seemed to be nailed to the floor. Now, wait a second. Are his feet nailed to the floor? Did somebody... No, oh, that's an idiom. Means he can't move, right? I knew those pups were mine. All mine, but I couldn't move. My heart started acting like a drunk grasshopper. Tried to swallow and I couldn't. My Adam's apple wouldn't work. One pup started my way. I held my breath. On he came until I felt a scratchy little foot stepping on mine. The other pup followed, a warm puppy tongue caressed my sore foot. I heard the station master say, "They already know you." I knelt down and gathered them in my arms. I buried my face between their wiggling bodies and cried. The station master, sensing something more than just two dogs and a boy, just stood there in silence. Rising with the two pups held close to my chest, I asked if I owed him anything. He said, "There's a small feed bill, but I'll take care of that. It's not much anyway." Taking his knife, he cut 2 slits in the sack. He put the pups in it, and it worked for their heads, their heads through the holes. As he handed the sack to me, he said, "Well, there you are. Goodbye and good hunting." Walking down the street toward town, I thought, now maybe these people won't stare at me when they see what I've got. After all, not every boy owns 2 good hunting hounds. Not everybody's been waiting for 2 long years for 2 good hunting hounds. I hadn't gone that far. I started raising my chest, walking real proud. I realized that the reception I got wasn't what I thought it would be. People began to stop and stare. Some even snickered. I couldn't understand why they were staring. Surely it could be at the 2 beautiful hound pups sticking out of my gunny sack, I supposed. Thinking that maybe I had a hole in the seat of my britches, I looked over to my reflection in the plate glass window. I craned my neck for a better view of my rear end. I could see a patch there all right, and a few threadbare spots, but no whiteness was showing through. I figured that the people were just jealous because they didn't have 2 good hounds. I saw a man coming down. He was staggering all over the street. Just as he was passing me, I heard him stop. As I looked back, I saw that he was staring wide-eyed at my sack. Closing his eyes, he rubbed them with his hands. Opening them up again, he stared, shaking his head. He staggered on down the street, just shaking his head. All around, people began to roar with laughter. Someone shouted, "What's the matter, John? You seeing things today?" I hurried on, wanting to get away from the stares and the snickers. It wouldn't have happened again in 100 years, but there they came. The same 2 old women I had met before. We stopped and had another glaring fight. One said, "I declare." The other one snorted, "Well, I never." My face burned. I couldn't take any more. After all, a man can stand so much and no more at the same town. In a loud voice, I said, "You may have these people fooled with those expensive-looking feathers in your hats, but I know what they are. They're goose feathers painted iodine." One started to say something, but her words were drowned out by the roar and laughter from everybody around. Gathering up their long skirts, they swished on down the street. All around me, people began to shout questions and laugh. One wanted to know if I had the mother in the sack too. Storekeepers stepped out and gawked. I could see the end of the street, but it looked as if it were 100 miles away. My face was as red as a fox's tail. I ducked my head, tightened my grip on the sack, and just kept walking. I don't know where they came from, but like chickens coming home to roost, they flocked around me. Most of them were about my age. Some were a little bit bigger. Some were smaller. They ganged around me, screaming and yelling. They started clapping their hands and chanting, "The dog boy has come to town! The dog boy has come to town!" My heart burst. Tears came rolling down my face. The day I had waited for so long had turned black and ugly. The leader of the gang was about my size. He had a dirty, freckled face, and his 2 front teeth were missing. Do you see that? dirty, wrinkled face, and his 2 front teeth are missing. I suppose he had lost them probably in a back alley fight one day. His shock of yellow sunburnt hair bobbed up and down as he skipped and jumped to the rhythm of the Dog Boy song that everybody else was singing. He wore a pair of cowboy boots. They were 2 sizes too big for him, no doubt handed down by an older brother. He stomped right on my bare right foot. I looked down and saw a drop of blood ooze from under the broken nail. It hurt like the dickens, but I gritted my teeth and I walked on. Freckleface pulled the ear of one of my little pups as we walked by, the girl pup. I heard her painful little cry. That was too much. I had not worked 2 long, hard years for my pups to have some freckled-faced punk pull their ears. Swinging the sack from my shoulder, I walked over and set it down in a doorway. As I turned around to face the mob, I doubled up my fist and I took a Jack Dempsey stance. Wow, Jack Dempsey stance. You know, that's an old name. You might want to have somebody look that up. Jack Dempsey, if I'm not mistaken, was a famous old boxer from back in the early 1900s. So this kid, after this freckle-faced punk pulled the ear of his little girl, he decided to set his sack off to the side. And now he's going to stand up and protect his dogs. I don't know how you feel about that. But there's a part of me that agrees with that. There's a part of me that says you shouldn't fight. Where do you stand on that? Swinging the sack from my shoulder, I walked over and set it down in a doorway. As I turned around to face the mob, I doubled up my fists and I took a Jack Dempsey stance. Freckleface said, "So, you want to fight?" He came in swinging. I reached way back in Arkansas somewhere. By the time my fist had traveled all the way down to the Cherokee Strip, there was a lot of power behind it. Smack on the end of Freckleface's nose, it exploded. With a loud grunt, he sat down in the dusty street, grabbing his nose in both hands. He started rocking and moaning. I saw the blood squeeze out between his fingers. Another one of those busters sailed in. He didn't want to fight. He wanted to wrestle. He stuck a finger right in my mouth. I ground down. Shaking his hand and yelling like the hoot owls were after him, he ran across the street. Another one bore in. I aimed for his eye, but my aim was a little low. It caught him in the Adam's apple. Right there, in the throat. A sick look came over his face. Bending over, croaking like a bullfrog that had been caught by a water moccasin, he started going round in circles. But there were too many of them. By sheer weight and numbers, they pulled me down. I managed to twist over on my stomach, and I buried my face in my arms. I could feel them beating and kicking my body. All at once, the beating stopped. I heard loud cries from the gang, turning over on my back. I was just in time to see the big sheriff plant a number 12 boot in the seat of the last kid. I just knew I was next. I wondered if he'd kick me while I was down, so I just covered up my eyes and just waited for the happening. I lay where I was. He started toward me. I closed my eyes. I felt a hand as big as an anvil clamp down on my shoulder. I thought, he's going to stand me up, and then he's going to knock me down. He raised me to a sitting position. His deep, friendly voice said, "You all right, son?" I opened my eyes. There was a smile on his wide, rugged face. In a choking voice, I said, "Yes, sir. I'm all right." He helped me to my feet. His big hands started brushing the dust from my clothes. "Those kids are pretty tough, son," he said. "But they're not bad. Not really. They'll grow up someday." "Marshal," I said, "I wouldn't have fought them, but they pulled my pup's ears." You know what? I got to stop for a real quick second. I need to ask you once again, do you feel like he was in the right to protect himself? Or do you feel like he should have tried something else? That's an important thought for you. I also want to ask another question. Do you remember something from earlier in the story where there was one against a whole bunch? Do you remember in chapter 1? Do you remember that time where this old man watched one hound get surrounded by a gang of other hounds, get kind of beat up, protect himself? Do you see how that story's happening again right now? But it's Billy. It's not just any dog, it's just Billy. I'm going to read that again about Marshall just to make sure that you remember where we were. This is Billy talking. Marshall, I said, I wouldn't have fought them, but they pulled my pup's ears. He looked over to my sack. One pup had worked its way almost out through the hole. The other one's head and two little paws were sticking out. Both of them were whimpering, trying to get out of the sack. A smile spread all over the big Marshall's face. So that's what started the fight, he said. Walking over, he knelt down and started petting the little pups. They're fine-looking hunting dogs, son, he said. Where'd you get them? I told him that I had ordered them from Kentucky. What'd they cost you, he asked. $40, sir, I said. He asked if my father had bought them for me. No, I said. I bought them for myself. He asked me where I got all that money. I worked it and I saved it, sir, I said. Takes a long time to save $40, he said. Yes, sir, I said. It took me 2 years. 2 years, he explained. I saw an outraged look come over that Marshall's face. Reaching up, he pushed his hat back. Glanced up and down that street. I heard him mutter something. There's not a one in that bunch with that kind of grit. Picking up my sack, I said, Thanks for helping me out. I guess I'd better be heading for home, sir. He asked where I lived. I said, Up the river a way. Well, you got time for a bottle of pop before you go, haven't you? I started to say no, but looking at his big friendly smile, I smiled and said, I guess I have, sir. Walking into a general store, the marshal went over to a large red box and pulled back that lid. He asked what kind I wanted. I'd never had a bottle of pop in my life, and I didn't know what to say. Seeing my hesitation, he said, This strawberry looks pretty good. I said it'd be fine. The cool pop felt wonderful to my hot, dry throat. My dark little world had brightened up again. I had my pups, and I had found a wonderful friend. I knew that the stories I had heard about marshals weren't true anymore. Never again would I be scared when I saw one. In fact, I'd probably go up and shake their hand. Back out on the street, I shook hands with the marshal, saying as I did, If you're ever up in my part of the country, sir, come over and see me. You can find our place by asking at my grandfather's store. Store? He asked. Why, the only store upriver is about 30 miles away from here. Yes, I said. That's my grandfather's place. He asked if I was afoot. Yes, I said. You won't make it all night tonight, he said, will you? No, sir, I said. I intend to camp out somewhere. I saw he was bothered. I'll be all right, I said. I'm not scared of the mountains. He looked at me and at my pups. Taking off his hat, he scratched his head, chuckling deep down in his barrel-like chest. Yeah, I guess you will be all right. Well, goodbye. Good luck. If you're ever in town again, look me up. From far down the street, I looked back. The marshal was still standing right in the middle of the road where I'd left him. He waved his hand, and I waved on back. On the outskirts of town, I stopped and picked up a can and my provisions. I hadn't gone far before. Oh, that's right. He left some things. Remember that? He left all those things hidden because he got some cloth for his mom and his sisters. I think he got a little bag of candy, if I'm not mistaken. He got something for his dad. What did he get him? You remember? Can't remember. I'll probably remember later, but I don't remember right now. They were doing all right. I took a look at them, and my pups cried and whimpered. They had long since pulled their heads back into the sack. I would peek in at them every once in a while we walked, and they were doing all right, curled up into two little round balls on my bundles. They were fast asleep. Deep in the heart of the Sparrowhawk Mountains, night began to overtake me. There in a cave with a stream close by, I chose to put up for the night. Taking my pups in bundles from the gunny sack, I used it to gather leaves to make us a small bed. My pups followed me on every trip, whimpering and crying, tumbling and falling over sticks and rocks. After the bed was made, I built a fire. In a can of water from the mountain stream, I boiled 3 eggs. Next, I boiled half of the remaining salt pork. Cutting the meat up into small pieces, I fed it to my little pups. Each of us had a piece of candy for dessert. My pups enjoyed that candy. With their needle-sharp teeth, they gnawed and worried with it until it was all melted away. While they were busy playing, I dragged up several large timbers and built a small fire which would last for hours and hours. In a short time, the cave started to grow warm and comfortable from the heat. The leaves were soft and felt good to my tired body and sore feet. As I lay stretched out, my pups crawled all over me. I played with them. They would waddle up to the front of the cave, look at the fire, and come scampering back and roll and play in the soft leaves. I noticed the boy dog was much larger than the girl dog. He was deeper red in color. His chest was broad and solid. His puppy muscles knotted and rippled under the velvety skin. He was different in every way. He would go closer to the fire. I saw right away he was bold and aggressive. Once he went around the fire and he started venturing out into the darkness. I waited to see if he'd come back. He came wobbling to the mouth of the cave, but hesitated there. He made several attempts to come back, but the flames were leaping higher by the minute. The space between the fire and the wall of the cave was much hotter than when he had ventured out. Whimpering and crying, he kept trying to get around the fire. I said not a word, just sat and watched. Puppy though he was, he did something which brought a major smile to my face. Getting as close as he could to the side of the cave, he turned his rear end to the fire, hopping sideways, yipping at every jump. He made it through the heat and sailed into the pile of leaves. He had had enough. Curling up in a ball close to me, he went straight to sleep. The girl pup was small and timid. Her legs and body were short. Her head was small and delicate. She must have been a runt in the litter. I didn't have to look twice to see what she lacked in power she made up in brains. She was a much smarter dog than the boy dog, more sure of herself, more cautious. I knew when the trail became tough later, she'd be the one to unravel it. I knew I had a wonderful combination. In my dogs, I had not only power, but brains to go along with it, and I was proud. I was tired, too. My legs were stiff and my feet were sore and they were throbbing. My shoulders were red and raw from the weight of the sack. I covered my pups up in the leaves and moved my body as close to them as I could. I knew as night wore on and the fire died down, the chill would come. Tired but happy, I fell asleep. Along in the silent hours of night, I was awakened. I opened my eyes but didn't move. I lay and listened, trying to figure out what it was that had aroused me. At first, I thought one of my pups had awakened me by moving and whimpering. I discarded this thought, for I could see that they were both fast asleep. I decided it must have been my imagination working. My fire had burned down, leaving only a glowing red body of coals. The cave was dark and silent. Chill from the night had started to creep in. I was on the point of getting up to rebuild my fire when I heard what had awakened me. At first, I thought it was a woman screaming out in the forest. I listened. My heart began to pound. I could feel the strain all over my body as nerves began to grow tighter and tighter. It came again, closer this time. The high pitch of the scream shattered the silence of the quiet night. The sound seemed to be all around us. It screamed its way into the cave and rang like a blacksmith's anvil against the rock walls. The blood froze in my veins. I was terrified. Although I had never heard one, I knew what that sound was. This was a scream of a mountain lion, a cougar. The big cat screamed again. Leaves boiled and stirred where my pups were. In the reflection of the glowing coals, I could see that one was sitting up. It was the boy dog. A leaf had become entangled in the fuzzy hair of a floppy ear. The ear flicked. The leaf dropped. Again, the hellish scream rang out over the mountains. Leaves flew as my pup left the bed. I jumped up and tried to call him back. Reaching the mouth of the cave, he stopped, raised his small red head in the air. He bawled his challenge to the devil cat. The bawl must have scared him as much as it had startled me. He came tearing back. The tiny hairs on his back were standing on end. My father told me lions were scared of fire. I started throwing on more wood. I was glad I'd dragged up a good supply while making camp earlier that night. Hearing a noise from the bed, I looked back. The girl pup, hearing the commotion, had got up and joined the boy dog. They were sitting side by side with their bodies stiff and rigid. Their beady little eyes bore into darkness beyond the cave. The moist tips of their little black noses wiggled and twisted, as if trying to catch a scent. What I saw in my pups gave me courage. My knees quit shaking and my heart stopped pounding. I figured that lion had scented my pups. The more I thought about anything harming them, the madder I got. I was ready to die for these dogs. Every time the big cat screamed, the boy dog would run to the mouth of the cave and bawl back. Hoo! I started whooping and throwing rocks down the mountainside, hoping to scare the lion away. Through the long hours of the night, I kept this up. The lion prowled around us, screaming and growling, first on the right, and then on the left, and above and below. In the wee hours of the morning, he gave up and left to stalk other parts of the mountains. I'm sure he thought he didn't stand a chance against two vicious hounds and a big, manly hunter. Are you getting that? Were there any parts of that got you afraid, that got you spooked? Yeah, that part with the mountain lion was really scary. It's okay. This book needs that. This book wants you to feel a little spook. Did you see what happened, though? What happened? What did we learn about those two pups? Did they hide in the corner of the cave while that mountain lion was there? Were they standing all bold and upright right at the mouth of the cave? What did Billy do? What made him feel more comfortable? Safe. Sure. What has Billy also realized about how he feels about these dogs? If something is going to start messing with these dogs, what's he going to do? What's Billy willing to do? I think he said he was willing to die for these dogs. Are you starting to feel that way too? I kind of am. You notice that he hasn't named them yet? Isn't that weird? He just has the girl pup and the boy pup. I think that's kind of funny. Maybe in this next chapter he'll figure it out. It's not a very long chapter, so stay with us, okay? I promise it's going to be totally worth it. You're not going to want to miss a thing. Chapter 6. After the terrifying night, the bright morning sun was a welcome sight. I fixed breakfast and soon we were on our way. I tried to get the pups to follow me so as to lighten my load. They would for a little ways, and then sitting down on their rears, they'd cry and they'd whimper. Back in the sack they would go with their heads sticking out of the holes and their long ears flopping. I moved on. Do you see that picture? It's so cute. Gunny sacks with two little puppy heads sticking out, hanging off the side of a boy who's just carrying them home through the mountains. About midday, I entered country I began to recognize. I wasn't far from home. I dropped down out of the mountains into the bottoms, far above the place I had crossed the river on my way to town. Staying on the left of the river, I followed its course past several campgrounds, but didn't stop until I came to the one where I had found the magazine. Here, I took the pups out of the sack and sat down in the warm sands next to the Illinois River. As the afternoon wore on, I sat there deep in thought. I was trying to think what I was going to tell my mother and father. I knew I was going to be in big trouble. I couldn't think of anything. Finally, I decided that I would just tell them the truth. And with the help of the new overalls, that's what he got, Dad. New overalls. I knew I'd find it. With the help of the new overalls, cloth, and candy, I would weather the storm of my parents and my sisters. My pups were having a big time playing. With their little front paws locked around each other, they were growling, rolling, and chewing on one another. They looked so cute, I laughed out loud. While I was watching their romping, the thought came, I haven't named them yet. Told you. I told you. You had to get a name soon, right? I hadn't named them yet. I went over the list of names. For him, I tried Red, Bugle, Lead, after name as before. For her, I tried Susie and Mabel, Clean, all kinds of girl names. None seemed to fit. Still mumbling names over and over, I glanced up. There, carved in a tree, in the white bark of a sycamore, was a large heart, and in the center of that heart were two names, Dan and Ann. The name Dan was a little larger than Ann. It was wide and bold. The scar stood out more of the tree. The name Ann was small, neat, and even. I stared, unbelieving, for there were my names. They were perfect. Perfect names. I walked over and picked up my pups. Looking at him, I said, Your name is Dan. I'll call you Old Dan. Looking at her, I said, "Your name, little girl, is Anne. I'm going to call you Little Anne." It was then I realized it was all too perfect. Here in this fisherman's camp, I had found the magazine and the ad. I had looked over at the old sycamore log. There I had asked God to help me get 2 hound pups. There were the pups, rolling, playing in the warm sand. I thought of the old KC baking powder can and the fishermen, how freely they had just given their nickels and dimes to a boy. I looked up again to the names carved in that tree. Yes, it was all there like a large puzzle, piece by piece, each fitting perfectly until the puzzle was complete. It could not have happened without the help of an unseen power. I stayed at the campground until dark. I knew I had to go home, but I put it off as long as I could. The crying of the pups telling me that they were hungry made up my mind for me. I knew that the time had come for me to face my mother and my father. I sacked up my dogs, waded the river. As I came out of the bottoms, I could see the lamplight glow from the windows of our home. One of the small yellow squares darkened for an instant. Someone had walked across the floor. I wondered who it was. I heard Daisy, our milk cow, too, and she was mooing. I was thinking so hard of what I would say, it startled me for a second. Reaching the gate to our house, I stopped. I had never thought of our home to be very pretty, but that night, our home looked different. It looked clean and neat and peaceful, nestled there in the foothills of the Ozark Mountains. Yeah, on that night, I was proud of our home. Ours, our home. My bare feet made no noise as I crossed that porch. With my free hand, I reached and pulled the leather that worked the latch. Slowly, the door swung inward. I couldn't see my father or sisters. They were too far to the right of me, but my mother was directly in front of me. She was sitting there in her old cane-bottom rocker. She was knitting. She looked up. I saw all the worry and grief leave her eyes. Her head bowed down. The knitting in her hands came up to cover her face. I stepped inside the room. I wanted to run to her and comfort her and tell her how sorry I was for all the worry and grief I had caused her. The booming voice of my father shook me from my trance. He said, "Well, what have you got there?" Laughing, he got up from his chair and he came over to see me. He reached and he took the sack from my shoulder. "When we started looking for you," he said, "I went to the store and your grandpa told me all about it. It wasn't too hard to figure what you had done, but you should have told us, son. You should have told us." I ran to my mother and, dropping to my knees, I buried my face in her lap. As my mama patted my head, I heard her say in a quavering voice, "Oh, why didn't you tell us, son? Why?" I couldn't answer. Between sobs, I heard the squeals of delight from my sisters as they fondled my pups. I heard my father say, "What's this other stuff you've got?" Without raising my head from my mother's lap, in a choking voice, I said, "One is for you, Papa. One's for Mama, and the others is for the girls." I heard the snapping of the string and the rattle of paper. The ohs and ahs from my sister were wonderful to hear. Papa came over to Mama, laying the cloth on the arm of her chair. He said, "Well, you've been wanting a new dress. Here's enough cloth to make a half a dozen dresses." Realizing that everything was forgiven, I stood up and dried my eyes. Papa was pleased with his new overalls. My sister forgot the pups for the candy. The light was shining from my mother's eyes as she fingered the cheap cotton cloth. That was something I will never forget. Mama warmed some milk for the pups. They drank until their little tummies were tight and round. As I ate, Papa sat down at the table and started talking man talk to me. He asked, "How are things in town?" I told him it was boiling with people. The wagon yard was full of wagons and teams. He asked if I had seen anyone I knew. I told him I hadn't, but the station master had asked about him. He asked me where I had spent the night. I told him about the cave in Sparrowhawk Mountains. He said that must have been the one called Robber's Cave. My youngest sister piped up, "Did you stay all night with some robbers?" My oldest sister said, "Silly, that was a long time ago. There aren't any robbers there now." The other one put her nickels worth in. "Weren't you scared?" "No," I said. "I wasn't scared of staying in the cave, but I heard a mountain lion scream and it scared me half to death." "Oh, they won't bother you," Papa said. "You had a fire, didn't you?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "They'll never bother you unless they are wounded or cornered. But if they are, you'd better look out." Papa asked me how I liked town. I said I didn't like it at all and wouldn't live there even if they ever gave me a chance. With a querying look on his face, he said, "I'm afraid I don't understand. I thought you always wanted to go into town." "I did, Papa," I said, "but I don't anymore. I don't like the people there and couldn't understand them." "What's wrong with them?" he asked. I told him how they had stared at me and how they had even laughed and made fun of me. He said, "Oh, don't think that they were making fun of you. Were they?" "Yes, they were, Papa," I said. "And to beat it all, the boys jumped on me and knocked me down in the dirt. If it hadn't been for the marshal, I would have taken a beating." Papa said, "So, you met the marshal. What'd you think of him?" At the mention of, I told him he was a nice man. He had bought me a bottle of soda pop. At the mention of soda pop, the blue eyes of my sisters, of course, started opening wide. They started firing questions at me, wanting to know what color it was and what did it taste like. I told them it was strawberry and it bubbled and tickled when I drank it, and it made me burp. The eager questions of my three little sisters had had an effect on my father and my mother. Papa said, "Billy, I don't want you to feel badly about people in town. I don't think that they were poking fun at you. Anyway, not like you think they were." "Maybe they weren't," I said, "but I still don't want to ever live in town. It's too crowded and you couldn't get a breath of fresh air." Interesting. How do you feel about living in town?" In a sober voice, my father said, "Someday you may have to live in town, son. Your mother and I don't intend to live in these hills all our lives. It's no place to raise a family. A man's children should have an education. They should get out and see the world and meet people." "I don't see why we have to move to town to get an education," I said. "Hasn't Mama taught us how to read and write?" "There's more to an education than just reading and writing," Papa said. "Much more." Now, it's important because if you don't know how to read, and you don't know how to write, and you don't know how to do math, there's a lot of things that make life a little bit harder. So you got to practice those things. But they are not the only things that one must learn in life. Did you realize you're in school right now? It's different. Feels different, doesn't it? Yeah. Anyway, I'm sorry. "I don't see why we have to move to town to get an education. There's more to an education than just reading and writing," Papa said. "Much more." I asked him when he thought we'd be moving to town. "Well, it'll be some time yet," he said. "We don't have the money now, but I'm hoping someday we will." From the stove, where she was heating salt water for my feet, Mama said in a low voice, "I'll pray every day and night for that day to come. I don't want you children to grow up without an education, not even knowing what a bottle of soda pop is, or even seeing the inside of a schoolhouse. I don't think I could stand that. I'll just keep praying, and someday the good Lord may answer my prayer." I told my mother I had seen the schoolhouse in town. Again, I had to answer 1,000 questions for my sisters. I told them that it was made of red brick and it was bigger than Grandpa's store, a lot bigger. There must have been at least 1,000 kids going to school there. I told all about the teeter-totters, the swings made out of log chains, the funny-looking pipe that ran up the side of the building, and how I had climbed up in it and slid out like the other kids. I didn't tell them how I came out, though. "I think that's called a fire escape," Papa said. "Fire escape," I said. "It looked like a slide to me." "Did you notice where it made that bend up at the top?" he said. I nodded my head. "Well, inside the school, there's a door," he said. "If the school gets on fire, they open the door. The children jump in the pipe and slide out to safety." "Boy, that's a keen way of getting out of a fire," I said. "Well, it's getting late," Papa said. "We'll talk more about this some other time. We'd better get to bed as we have a lot of work to do tomorrow." My pups were put in the corn crib for the night. I covered them with shucks and kissed them goodnight. The next day was a busy one for me. With the hamper and help of my sisters, I made a little doghouse for the pups. Papa cut the ends off of his check line and gave them to me for collars. With painstaking care, deep in the tough leather, I scratched the names. Old Dan on one and Little Ann on the other. With a nail and a rock, 2 holes were punched in each end of the strap. I put them round their small necks and laced together with some baling wire. That's kind of like thick leather strap. And one says Old Dan, Little Ann, and then he puts it around like a necklace and then ties it with a little bit of baling wire, which must be pretty thin. So now they have collars, right? They need their collars, and their names are on them. So what does that do? Does that show that they belong to somebody? I often think that the collar often means that they belong to somebody, and I need to respect whose dogs they are. Sorry. That evening, I had a talk with my mother. I told her about praying for the two pups, about the magazines and the plans I had made. I told her how hard I had tried to find names for them and how strange it was finding them carved in the bark of a sycamore tree right next to where I found the advertisement. With a smile on her face, she asked, "Do you believe God heard your prayer and helped you?" "Yeah, Mama," I said. "I know He did, and I'll always be thankful." And that is chapter 6. So he made it home. He's got 2 brand new baby pups. Did you see how it felt when he first held on to them? Did you see how hard it was for him to even think that they were his? He'd been working so hard for it. He'd been doing it so much that he couldn't even believe that it's actually coming true. Couldn't believe it. Now, as we end this beautiful day together, I can't thank you enough for being here. I know that you live busy lives, and I know that you could be doing almost anything other than listening to somebody read to you. But I want to thank you for being a part of this, because it means the world to me that we get to do this together. This is something that I love to do in my classroom. This is something that I love to do with friends. This is something that I like to do when I had the fortune of being on stage sometimes as an actor. This is when words come alive. And I hope that the story is coming alive for you. I hope that you understand that Billy dreamed, and Billy wished, and Billy worked, and Billy got his 2 little pups. It's not going to be easy to take care of them. Like my friend Jensen says with his dog, Sammy, it's a lot of work to take care of a puppy. So I'm sure we're going to get into some learnings coming up soon. And without further ado, I want you to make sure that you take the time to enjoy your life, to go out and explore, to go out and see what this world can offer. Go out and be barefoot like Billy. Feel what it feels like to be there. Make the soles of your feet a little bit tougher. Until tomorrow, ladies and gentlemen, I will say adios, and I will say thank you for being here. Come back tomorrow, share it, do whatever you want. If you happen to decide that you did some verbal to visual work, I would love for you to share it. Thank you to everybody who's been here. And without further ado, please stay safe. Please make sure you stay at home. Please appreciate this moment with your families, and I'll look forward to seeing you soon. Without further ado, I love you. Now get out of here.